Good morning. It's a beautiful morning. It's a beautiful space. We're in a room with people who want to learn and grow and help others learn and grow and make the world a better place. What could be better? I'm grateful for this day and for all of us to be together. I'm grateful to the Leadership Circle for inviting me to be here. So thank you to Sandra Bannister, Roma Gaster, Greg Lowry, and Adele Richards. Thank you so much for having me here. Well, leadership alchemy. That's a kind of a provocative, esoteric title, isn't it? Makes you curious. We're going to talk this morning about leadership alchemy, and I'm going to share with you 6 creative powers that I've been working with in my work in order to practice leadership alchemy. It's an esoteric, kind of provocative title, but when we say demystifying leadership alchemy, we want to kind of translate the idea, which is very powerful, the idea of alchemy in a leadership context. We want to translate that into something that is practical for you, something that you can take home and make use of personally and in your organization. So let's start by just looking at what do we mean when we say alchemy. Alchemy is an ancient practice. It is rooted in the idea of transforming something raw and basic, something maybe dense, into something more valuable. The classic definition of alchemy is transmutation of lead into gold, right? We're all familiar with that kind of basic description of alchemy. Alchemy also combines this element of kind of science and magic. It was always a combination of science. Some people say that alchemy was the predecessor of modern-day chemistry. And then it also had this kind of mystical element where the science was going on and then all of a sudden a miracle occurs and there's gold. And finally, alchemy actually takes place in a crucible that allows impurities to be burned away. So the crucible is a container that's able to withstand great heat, great pressure. Now let's look at what we mean when we say leadership alchemy. If alchemy is about transforming raw materials into something more precious, leadership alchemy is about transforming our raw materials, which is really our hearts and minds, into something more precious and valuable. So how do we transform our thinking as leaders? How do you, here this morning, transform your thinking into something more valuable, something more precious? And as leaders, how do you help the people in your organization transform their thinking into something more precious? I was working with a major global brand earlier this year. It's a company that everybody in this room knows. And I was working with the CIO, Chief Information Officer, and his top 70 leaders from around the world. And he and I were talking, and he said, I focus a lot of my effort as a leader on thinking, on making sure that my thinking is open and generative, and working with my people on their thinking. He said there's nothing more valuable than the way we think, particularly about possibilities, about obstacles, and about innovation. The second part of leadership alchemy is looking at neuroscience and magic. So we've learned a lot over the last few years about, well, I guess really the last 15 years, about neuroscience, about how our minds, our brains, are not necessarily formed by the time we're 5 years old, and we're stuck with that as we previously believed, that you're kind of wired the way you're wired by the time you're 5. Well, we found that that's not true at all, that our brains are highly plastic, that we can continue to refine and exercise our brains to become more and more effective all the time. So leadership alchemy is about understanding how we can use neuroscience for ourselves and for the folks in our organization. And then the second part of this is about spirit. And I don't mean spirituality, I don't mean necessarily spirituality or religion. When I say spirit, I'm talking about that essential element that is deep down inside all of us. It's our inherent goodness, it's our inherent essence, it's a creative force. How many of you feel you have this kind of creative force that's flowing through you that yearns to express itself? How many of you feel that way, that it's something that yearns to come out? Maybe it's writing a book, maybe it's leading a great team, maybe it's raising a healthy, functional family. But we have that creative force that yearns to express itself. And that's what we're talking about in leadership alchemy, is how do we unlock that for ourselves and for the people that we work with? How do we really tap into this wonderful creative force? And finally, leadership alchemy calls upon leaders to be architects in building a container that's able to withstand great heat and great pressure, that allows a burning away of impurities, that enables everyone associated with that enterprise to manage their self-imposed limitations in different ways and unlock more of our potential. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about leadership alchemy. Now, alchemy and magic have a great deal in common. Alchemy is about the idea, the purpose of transforming something base into something precious. It's about the purpose. And magic is about how do we do that. And that's kind of where I've spent my life. For the past 2 years, I've been kind of exploring this question. What can we learn from magicians? I've studied and practiced magic most of my life, over 44 years. And I know you say, how does such a good-looking young guy, he can't be more than 44. But this has been a question that has really intrigued me for the last couple of years, is what deeper wisdom can we learn from the magic world? And I've been looking for deeper meaning in magic for, probably the last 20 years. There was a point in time where I became, no pun intended, disillusioned with magic. It's kind of like, okay, you pull a rabbit out of a hat, so what? It's an interesting puzzle, but what's the point? And so I actually started doing research on magic and looking into the origins and the history of magic, and found that our history actually goes way back to the medicine men and medicine women in tribal communities, the shamans, who actually used basic kinds of rudimentary magic tricks to connect people with that deeper source, to give you an experience of, wow, for a moment, anything is possible. You know that feeling? I call it the power of wow. That moment when you see the magic happen and you're a child again and you're reconnected with all kinds of possibility, it's just a wonderful moment. And then unfortunately in today's day and age, we very quickly move on to, how do you do that? And we lose it. And I think we lose something precious there. We lose, even if we just talk about it as a source of innovative thinking in organizations, we lose that ability to kind of let go of debating and criticizing and disbelieving, and we move into, wow, what is possible? You know, a magician shows us that anything is possible. And what if we just could stay in that a little bit more than we do? And so one of the suggestions I have for you for the next 50 minutes is that you let go of that urge to say, how did he do that? And stay with, wow. I think it's a sacred place. I think it's a very special place to be. And so catch yourself if you find yourself going there and just say, this is not a trick to be figured out. It's an effect to influence me, to work on me, and see where that takes you. So I hope this question about magic and what we can learn from the wisdom of the field of magic has interest for you. Yes? This really would have sucked if you weren't interested in that. So, I would like to officially welcome you to the world of magic. You probably noticed my snappy boutonniere over here. There are 3 primary effects in magic: appearance, disappearance, and restoration. And so I'd like to kind of demonstrate those to you, starting off with appearance. Lighter. Thank you. God bless you. It's always nice to get recognition, isn't it? So that is appearance. And now for disappearance, I'm going to make the ball disappear. Did you see it go? It's a messy trick. So that was disappearance. And then finally, we look at restoration. And for this, I'm going to need to fish out a little piece of shell. Keep that in plain view. And this always works nicely when there's a little rhythm going on. And so if you would, let's get a little clapping going on, kind of a slow little rhythm. And we'll work with the shell, and we'll see if we can get some restoration going on. I'm going to just help it along a little bit, give it a little rub. It starts to grow. Keep that rhythm going. We're almost there. We're almost there. And there it is, restored. The leadership circle is paying for cleaning, aren't you? So those are the 3 effects we're going to look at today: appear, disappear, and restore. Those are the 3 primary effects of magic. And to do that, we're going to look at these 6 creative powers: inspiration, words, relationships, self-awareness, authenticity, and mastery. So we'll be kind of looking at these one by one as we go through this. So let's look first at the act of appearance. When the magician makes something appear, we're actually not making it appear. We're actually revealing something. The truth is right there in front of your eyes. Years of self-denial. Evidence of a misspent youth. So this is profound, I think, in that we don't just conjure up something out of thin air. And Greg mentioned this in his remarks, is that what we create does not come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere. And that the process of making something appear is a revelation. Jonathan, our next speaker, is going to be talking about this also, and talking about it's sometimes a remembering of a deeper truth, about our essence, about who we are really deep down inside, and yet during the course of our days, we get so involved in reacting to life that it sometimes is difficult to come from that place where we're remembering our true essence, that creative force that flows through us. And so what is it that yearns to be revealed for you? What is it that yearns to be revealed for your organization? What's the truth that yearns to be revealed? When our actions are informed by what's important to us and what really matters deep down inside, it unlocks a creative energy that is extremely powerful. To me, it's about connecting with something that we love, something that's very important to us. And when we can create an organization that allows people to connect with something that's deeply important, then a real certain kind of magic can happen. What matters to me inside? And can I find a place where what matters to me inside is the same thing that matters for the organization? What is it that our organization does that has deeper value and is in service of this world? When we connect with those things, we unlock a force, a power that we lose track of in the hectic day-to-day, and it just seems to really escalate in our world. So that's what appearance is really about. It's about connecting and revealing a deeper truth. Just as an interesting side point, the egg effect that I just shared with you, I invented to propose to the love of my life, who is here in front. The beautiful Jennifer Tokar. And it was love that inspired the creative force to kind of come forward and create something that's the first new effect that I've created in probably 10 years. And so it was driven by love. So appearance, that's what appearance really is. It's about revealing something. That's the what. But now let's look at the how. And we're going to kind of explore the way we think. And I'll do that kind of very slowly, one step at a time. We begin with an inspiration. We want to create something. And so we've got a general concept. And we're going to create a ball. Words, so we begin with inspiration, then it starts to come into the world, it starts to take form through words, ball. Words generate pictures. We are visual creatures. And so a picture starts to come into play. Now, if we stop there, we'll be stuck with whatever comes out. It could be a golf ball, it could be a soccer ball, it could be anything. Let's get specific. We're going to call this bowling ball. And then the picture starts to get more clear. Now this is where I invoke the classic magic word. You all know it. You ready? Ready? Abracadabra. This is a trick I also call the oh shit magic trick. It is a real bowling ball, and it's very fun to travel with. And let's just kind of walk through that process of making something appear. So we begin with something, we're inspired to create something. It takes its first form into the world through words, and then, and those words generate an image, and then it comes into being. There's a point along the way, though, where I say abracadabra, and that's not a mistake. I mean, it's intentional. Abracadabra, actually, is a word with ancient Hebrew Aramaic roots. And abracadabra actually means what I speak is what I create. And compliments of the leadership circle, you all should have received a lovely wristband that says abracadabra, what I speak is what I create. This is a tool that actually Jennifer created. And people find it useful to be reminded about the power of words. What are the words that you're choosing in your internal kind of dialogue? What kind of words are you using with the people around you and in your organization? She and I have fun with it when we'll start to get into negative thinking and go down a rat hole. You know, we will say to each other, abracadabra, or we'll reach over and we'll snap the wristband. And so it's a useful tool. This is where I grew up, Beulah, Michigan. People from Michigan always describe where they're from by holding up their hands because Michigan looks like a mitten. And so I'm from up here in the little finger on Lake Michigan. And Beulah is so small that it actually says Beulah on both sides of that sign. I was raised by my grandparents. My mother and my sister were killed by a drunk driver when I was 3 years old. And so my father took me to live with my mother's parents, and they raised me, and that was the greatest gift of my life. They were wonderful, loving people. My grandfather was quite a character. When I first went to live with them, we lived in a little farmhouse that didn't have indoor plumbing. It had an outhouse. And then in 1965, we built a new house, but we kept the little farmhouse, and my grandparents would have parties there. My grandfather put speakers down underneath the seats in the outhouse. And when they would have their parties, someone would go out to the outhouse, and he'd give them about 10 seconds. And then he'd grab the microphone and say, "Hey, move over up there. I'm trying to paint down here. You're blocking the light." That's the kind of guy my grandpa was. At dinner on the farm, I would usually practice a magic trick. You practice in front of your family because they're safe and they can give you feedback, and if you mess up, no harm. So I would usually practice a magic trick at dinner. And then at night, before I went to sleep, Grandpa would usually sit on the edge of my bed, and he would tell stories about the amazing Andy Bennett, who was this child magician that would tour the world, and every night. And then in the morning, on the evenings when I did a magic trick at dinner, in the morning, sitting at my spot at the breakfast table would be a script. This is an actual script from 1975 that my grandfather wrote for me. And don't read the jokes because they are terrible, but they're clean. And so Grandpa was really, he was my agent, he was my writer, he was my driver. I couldn't drive. And, he was just such a great guy. I had my own TV show when I was 14 years old. Here I am. And so I share this with you because it kind of demonstrates the power of words when you think about it, about what can be created when that kind of container is put in place, where someone is really bringing out the best that's in you and nurturing that and playing a very active role in it. So words are just so extremely powerful. That's part of what I was talking about when I talked about being an architect of a container. So that's the essence of appearance. Appearance is about a revelation. It's about revealing something. Appearance is about inspiration, which comes from the Latin word spirare, which means breath of life, breathing life into something. Are you breathing life into your work? Are you breathing life into your organization? Is there that spirit present that allows you to connect with the best that's inside you, the best that's in others? We have such a wonderful opportunity in life to connect with that goodness that's in all of us. And I don't know, we get afraid, I think, a lot in organizations, and we don't tap into that. It's such a beautiful source that we're missing out on. But I think part of our opportunity in this lifetime is to play our part in the evolution of that, connecting with that deep source and that deep power that will make the planet continue to get better. And finally, words are part of making something appear, that remembering what we speak is what we create. That's appearance. Here are some questions to think about in applying the ideas of appearance. First of all, what is it that you want to create through your work? What is it that yearns to be expressed through your work? We spend a lot of our lives at work. And how wonderful if we can bring into the world, through our work, what matters most to us in our hearts. Secondly, how does our company make life better? I believe every organization adds value, adds service to the planet, and we don't connect with that often enough. How does our organization, our products and services, how does it make life better? Next, what words do I need to use in here and between people to bring out the best, to nurture that spirit? And the last question is an interesting one. What would a word audit reveal about our organization? If you could walk invisibly through the organization and stick your ear into a cubicle or hang out at the water cooler, what kind of words would you hear and what's being generated by those words? Let's move on to disappearance. This is really interesting. One of the first things that people say when they find out I'm a magician, and I'm not kidding about this, one of the first things they say is, "Can you make my boss disappear?" Or wife. "Can you make my wife disappear?" Well, it's interesting that you say that because I don't hear people say husband. It's boss or wife. And I'm sure Dr. Freud would have a great time with what that means. So let me just give you a demonstration of disappearance. I'm going to say the magic word, lactose intolerance. And it's gone. Huh? No. Way too long a pause. All right, it's not that good a trick, right? Well, this is actually an important part of the point, which is when magicians do a disappearing act, we're actually not making something disappear, we're actually concealing it. It's an act of concealment. And so I think when someone says, can you make my boss disappear, can you make my wife disappear, what they're really saying, there's a little edge to it. And there's been times when I've been in my own reactive mood where someone will say, oh, can you make my wife disappear? And I'll say, well, why would you say that? You know, and that conversation usually goes nowhere. It's when I'm feeling pissy, I thought. Okay. So it's actually the act of disappearance is about concealment, and what we're really wanting to go away is our anxiety. And so I think we get sophisticated at the ways that we deflect our own responsibility. We want things to go away, and so what we actually do is we conceal our responsibility instead of kind of stepping up to it. I began my career working for a former presidential candidate, Ross Perot. He was my first, not my first boss, but one of my earliest bosses. And I was doing a temporary assignment in Dallas, and I walked into the office one day, and I walked by his office, and I think I was kind of looking down, and he came into my office, and he said, I don't know if this will work here, if you've had any exposure to Ross Perot, but he came in and he said, Andy, I noticed you were kind of looking down in the mouth. And he sat down, and I proceeded to complain about all the bosses that I'd had that didn't know what they were doing and how they were holding me back, and you know, you've heard these stories, right? And so there was a pause after I got through venting, and he looked around my office and he said, I noticed you got a lot of pictures on the walls. I said, yeah. He said, these different teams you've been on in the company? I said, yes. He said, you ever notice what they all have in common? I said, no. You? Thank you very little. And that was a bitter pill to swallow. But he was right. You know, I didn't want to kind of step into my own responsibility for what went on, and it was a lot easier for me to kind of hide it under the rug. But, you know, once he pointed that out to me, then I was able to really take responsibility and truly make that anxiety disappear. I think one of the greatest gifts we can have when we're trying to make something disappear is a box jumper. This is a magician's term for assistant. The people who jump in and out of boxes. We call them box jumpers. And so in the story I just told, Ross was my box jumper. Don't tell him I called him a box jumper. But a box jumper is a trusted advisor, someone that you know will tell you the truth and that will hold you to your highest self, that will hold you to your highest standard. This is my first box jumper, Mark Bordeaux. We were 7 years old offering magic shows in the neighborhood. He's still my best friend. He was there when I proposed to Jennifer. And he still tells me the truth. He still tells me the blunt, honest truth, even when I don't want to hear it. So a box jumper is so important. A box jumper helps you become aware of your blind spots. And when we're trying to make our anxiety disappear, that box jumper can help us see, you know what you're doing here, right? So a box jumper is a really important part because we develop beliefs and they become they become unconscious. We develop them so quickly. Let me give you an example. I've got a length of rope here, and to do this, I have to educate you just a little bit on the construction of rope. A rope has two ends and a middle. So if we were to cut off one end, we're now left with just one end and a middle. So if we were to cut off that end, we're now left with just a very large middle. So it occurs to me, if we were to cut the rope in the middle, it should disappear, right? It makes sense when you think about it. If that makes sense to you, then this should make sense to you. If you weigh 150 pounds and you can lift 180 pounds, couldn't you sit in a chair and fly? I actually need to get 2 pieces of rope from this, and so if we were to cut it right about there, that would give us about 2 equal pieces of rope, yes? Great. I'm going to have one of you actually handle the cutting part, and so I have enjoyed your smile from the stage. Would you be so kind? I'm going to just ask you to realize that this is the rope, and these are my fingers. I had a friend not too long ago. He was performing in Las Vegas, and he had the tip of his thumb cut off. And so I just wanted to make sure. Awesome. We now have 2 equal pieces of rope. One for, okay, they're not quite equal. That's all right. If you would you just even that up for me, please? Beautiful. Now we've got 2 equal pieces of rope. One for me, one for you. This is not going well. What organization are you from? You don't want to say? I'll take the scissors back because you're really not very good at this. This is actually a fuse welding process that takes place in my bare hands. And right before your eyes, the rope is now back together in one solid piece. You're very generous. God bless you. Thank you. No, it's not that good a trick. Actually, if we were to bring up the ends, right about there is the middle, we could slide the knot down to the middle. In fact, we could slide the knot right off the rope. We don't need it, and we've got a whole new piece of rope, and we can start all over again. I have permission from the Magic Circle to show you how this is done for educational purposes because it shows you how quickly and unconsciously we develop beliefs. I actually plant seeds in your mind. I give you a belief so that when you see something in the future, you have no choice but to see something that's not true. If I were to cut the rope in the middle, the trick would be impossible. This is a legitimate rope. And so what we do is we cut off this much of the rope, the end. How do we do that? We actually bring, as we're bringing the middle up, we leave it behind, clipped under my thumb. We grab that end, and we bring it up as if it were the middle, so that when we cut there, we're cutting it right there. Now, the way it works out is very nice, because when we bring it up, we clip it there, I bring up that end, we cut, and I bring down the ends. So at the beginning of the trick, I hold the rope out a number of times with the side by side. Those are the seeds that I'm planting. I actually do it 3 times in the beginning. Those are the seeds that are planted. That's the belief that I've given you, and you're not aware of it. But when you see the ropes side by side, you go back in your mind to a time when you've seen 2 ropes side by side, the seeds I planted, and so you have no choice but to see those ropes side by side. But it's not the truth. You ready for the truth? There's the truth. And then we just tie the rope there, and this is the fun part where it slides. And so now you can go home and be the life of the party. But that's how quickly and unconsciously we develop beliefs. That was just a fun little trick. And then we don't give it any thought. We're just unconscious to it. Box jumpers can help us see those blind spots. Really important allies in making things disappear. So in making things disappear, the analogy for a magician is that it's about concealing something. In leadership alchemy, it's about concealing our personal responsibility. And box jumpers are those trusted advisors that hold us to our highest self. And self-awareness is really the key to questioning our assumptions and beliefs. Let's look now at some questions when we're trying to make things disappear. With the things that you are wanting to make disappear, the ones particularly that you want to deflect, you want to blame someone or offer an explanation, particularly with those, what is your personal responsibility? Because they don't truly disappear unless you get to the bottom of it, which is really about what we have responsibility for. It's kind of that old saying of wherever you go, there you are. Next, what strategies have you developed and probably turned over to your unconscious functioning to deal with anxiety? Do you try to make yourself look good as a way of managing your anxiety? Do you try to please others? Do you distance yourself? Maybe you're critical. This is one of the things that I love about the leadership circle model, is that it enables you to really see those tendencies and to become conscious, to become self-aware about the ways in which we manage our anxiety. That they're success strategies to a point, but they have their limitations. And finally, do you have trusted advisors that will tell you the truth and hold you to your highest standard? Some questions about disappearance. Now let's talk about restoration. I've got a newspaper that I brought along, and this is kind of a way of talking about restoration and kind of illustrating it graphically. Because as we go through life, stuff happens. Relationships get torn apart. Sometimes it's expectations that go unmet. For organizations, it may be a market changes. And sometimes we suffer. And organizations suffer as well. I come from Michigan, the heart of the auto industry, and the state has been devastated by the downturn in the auto industry, particularly for American vehicles. And we've had the highest number of one-way truck rentals, moving truck rentals, out of state in the state of Michigan because it's been so devastated. But stuff happens in life, and things get torn apart. And so the process of restoration is about finding the deeper meaning in those things. Now, in the world of the magician, the act of restoration, the act that I just showed you, is actually not about restoration. It's an act of substitution. There's a whole newspaper somewhere, and I switch. I do the switcheroo. And so restoration is a replacement or a substitution. And so the idea here is that we replace something that's no longer useful with something that is useful. Let's think about that in terms of stories that no longer serve us, me, or our organization. Stories that we may be stuck in. Let me tell you a story of restoration. This is the farm where I grew up. That's our house, kind of off to the side there, the house that we built after the outhouse house. And this is a beautiful elm tree growing there. This picture was taken around 2003. And the tree stands over our barn, the barn where my grandfather committed suicide when I was 17 years old. And that tree, what's interesting about the elm tree, I went there in 2003 as I was going through my own personal transformation process. I had built my dream home, and I had become extremely ill. I lost 40 pounds, and it turns out that the home was infected with toxic mold. I ended up losing the home, going bankrupt, and I moved into an apartment that was on the 3rd floor of a 3-story apartment building. I was starting over. Well, one August afternoon, lightning struck my bedroom roof, started a fire, the roof collapsed, everything was gone. Within the course of 3 months, I lost everything financially, I lost everything materially, and that was it. I had the clothes on my back. So that was the kind of that dark night of the soul that they talk about, where everything's stripped away. And I started to reevaluate my life. I had spent so much effort accumulating things and pursuing an image that made it look like I was a success. It was so important to me. And I was miserable. And so I went through this time, and I went back to the farm, and that's when I walked up to the front door of the farm, and I rang the doorbell, and the old man that we had sold it to came to the door. And I said, "I'm wondering if I can just walk around the farm, if you would mind." And he said, "No, I'll go with you if that's all right." And I said, "That would be great." And so we walked down, and we walked down underneath the elm tree. And he spread his arms, and he said, "This is my church." And it's just a magnificent elm tree. It's just so beautiful. And I stood there looking at the elm tree, and behind me was the barn that I had not gone into since my grandfather died there. And I had all of this pain in my heart, all of this suffering between the loss of my mother, even though I was 3 years old, that affects a 3-year-old. And my father was not involved in my life. And then my hero killed himself, and a house is lost, and everything I'd worked for. And, I was just so much pain. I'm standing there looking at the tree, and the barn is behind me, and it truly felt like someone breathing down my neck, just this breathing down my neck. And I looked at the tree, and now let me take a little tangent. The elm tree in North America does not exist anymore. They were devastated by Dutch elm disease. They were all destroyed. But this tree continues to thrive. And Jennifer and I went there a couple of years ago, and it's still magnificent. When I was growing up, it was a cherry farm, and so the agronomists from the agricultural college in Michigan would come up to count the cherry trees that we had to do a census. And they would walk by this elm tree, and they couldn't figure out why this elm tree lived. Well, the farmers that owned the farm before us kept a bull chained to that elm tree. And the bull would walk circles around the elm tree, and it kind of cut a trench into the tree. When they left, they cut the chain, they left it around the tree, they cut it, and the tree continued to grow around the chain. When I was a little boy, parts of the chain were still hanging out of it as it grew around it. When Jennifer and I were there 2 years ago, we took this photograph, and you can't see it real well anymore, but can you make out the scar there? Well, I grew up with that story, And what the agronomists found as they did their research, why did this tree live? And they took core samples. Why did this tree live? It had an abundance of iron in it. So I'm standing there that day with Mr. Kalnins, and I'm looking at that tree, and I'm feeling the barn behind me, and I'm seeing that scar, and all of a sudden, I realized that maybe it's our scars that make us profoundly strong. The scar saved the tree. What if my scars can save me? What if my scars are actually the insight that will help me make life better for others? And the transformation was instantaneous. Now back to this picture of the tree looking over the barn. You'll notice that the barn isn't visible. The tree and everything that it represents, hope and strength and learning through suffering, overshadows the darkness by a long shot. And isn't that powerful? To think about our own pain, our own suffering, and I mean that for organizations too. I see a lot of organizations suffering, whether it's been inflicted by changes in their markets or leadership that, in my experience, I've worked with lots and lots of organizations around the world. I'm an OD consultant. I've spent the last 20 years doing OD consulting, and I spent the first 10 years in the corporate world. So I've seen lots of organizations, and I think you'll all agree with me that culture flows from the leader. I've just seen way too many examples of how true that is. And so where there's suffering in an organization, there can also be that kind of transformative breakthrough of looking at that suffering and saying, how does this make us stronger? Let's look at that. How does it inform us about what's important and about how we have grown and grown stronger as a result of it? And that's what I think restoration is really all about. It's about looking at what we need to change in the way we frame our stories, and how by being courageous and transparent and vulnerable, how much that frees other people to access that deep power that's inside them as well. That's restoration. Some questions to think about when it comes to restoration. What have you learned from your adversity? What story needs to be reframed so that it better serves you? And what have you learned in your organization that you need to reframe in order to make it serve your organization more? These are some good questions, I think. Now let's look at mastery. We think of mastery usually in terms of skills, but there's also an approach to growing as leaders that we can take when it comes to mastery. If we look at the world of magic for wisdom about mastering leadership, there are some things, and I'll use the egg trick as an example of what's required for mastery. That particular trick, it lasts about 2.5 minutes. It took me 80 hours to devise it. And a great deal of research went into it. The practice part of it, I practiced it 100 times before I did it in public with Jennifer and her family and our friends in the backyard. And it's on YouTube, by the way, The Proposal. It's called A Magically Extraordinary Proposal. But I practiced it 100 times before I ever did it in public. And that's the kind of commitment and intensity that it takes for mastery. Structure, I think, is important. And when we're trying to learn something new, I've found that attaching what we want to do that's new to something that's old, a structure that already exists, is a really great way to shift things. So if you're working on the power of words, for example, and being more mindful of using generative words in your organization, what if you were to take a structure that already exists, like meetings, and you began your meetings by talking about what are we working on as a team that's in alignment with where our organization is going? What a great positive anchoring activity to do at the beginning of a meeting, and it takes maybe 5 minutes to do that. So in terms of mastery, it's changing, developing mastery at something we can attach it to an existing structure. Mentoring is such an important part of mastery. As I started to hit roadblocks in developing the egg trick, I was able to turn to other folks in the magic community and get their advice on things. One of the kind of arcane parts of that trick that you don't know about is that it involves gin. I am so drunk right now. I won't remember this later. No, it does. It involves gin, and it was because I reached out to one of the other masters in the community and said, how do I do this? And he goes, you use gin. I wrote back to him and I said, how did you ever figure that out? Some old drunk. And so mastery requires those things. And finally, when it's all said and done, it comes down to choice and making different choices. Mastering a new practice, if you will, requires choosing to make, to think differently, to speak differently, to be vulnerable, to be challenging. And so it comes down to a personal choice. So let's just talk finally. I'm not advancing, David. Good. About building the crucible. As leaders, being an architect of a place that allows the people in the organization to burn away the impurities. The impurities are those self-imposed limitations that hold us back, and most of what holds us back, those things are self-imposed. I'm going to, by way of illustrating what we're talking about with the crucible, the container, I'm going to actually use a container, and I'm just going to fill it with water. And we're going to let it incubate for a few minutes underneath this napkin, like so, just like this. And I'm going to use a deck of playing cards and ask one of you to just select a card. Who can do this? Sir, you look like you know your way around a deck of cards. What are you trying to say? Have you played a game or two? Once or twice. Okay, good. The cards are interesting because how many suits in a deck? How many seasons in a year? How many cards in a deck? And how many weeks in a year? If you add up all of the pips on a deck of cards, they are 364. That's why we have the Joker. That's 365, the days of a year. So they're symbolic. And this morning they're symbolic in that they're going to represent people in an organization. And each person is unique. Each person has their own hopes, dreams, aspirations. They're all different. And Mark, if you would be so good, I'm just going to riffle through the cards. I want you to just stop me whenever you feel like saying stop. Right there. Go ahead and look. Doesn't matter if I see it. Got it? Did you? You can see it too? I like to ask other people because if you forget, the trick really stinks. And now you'll notice that this deck, it's one of those cards from a casino where it's got a hole punched through it so that you don't use it again. Now I'm going to reach into my pocket with an empty hand because I've got a lock that fits right through that hole. And I'm going to lock up the deck. And this is symbolic because if these are all of our hopes and dreams and aspirations, in a lot of organizations, they remain locked up. And so now this is the part where I'm always reminded in using a lock, the great escape artist Harry Houdini. He once said, "You may lock me up, but my face will still break out." My grandpa wrote that joke. And now we're going to say the magic word I learned in church, bingo. He wrote that one too. I'm going to run through the cards, and Mark, I'd like you to stop me when we get to your card. That one, what's that? What if I forgot? Did you remember? Okay, you got backup. Yeah. Just stop me when, it was kind of in the middle. Now remember, each card represents an individual's hopes, dreams. We're all unique. Not there? Surprise, surprise. Not really a surprise. So we started with a container, a crucible. It's a place where people can be safe to bring their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, where their self-imposed limitations burn away. And with empty hands, I'm approaching the crucible now, and I just want to see. We've got a card with a hole. The 7 of Hearts. Is that your card, Mark? So in closing, end on a high note. In closing, the creation of the container from a leadership perspective, that's been one of the fascinating things. Been one of the things that's really driven me in my work because I'm so fascinated by how leaders create containers. And I've come to the conclusion from these stories of my personal life and the work that I've done, I've come to the conclusion that there's nothing greater that a leader can do than create a container that creates hope. They're actually starting to do studies now about hope and leadership. And for folks who want to see a measurable connection between the two, personally, I don't need any kind of numbers or data. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that hope is powerful stuff. And the word prosperity comes from a 2-part Latin word, prospera. That actually means toward hope. So when we talk about prosperity, we're talking about moving toward hope. So think about that, how powerful it is. So I wish you all great prosperity, and I say this with a final abracadabra.
Amazing, huh? Wow. I'm Roma Gaster, and I'm one of the directors of the Leadership Circle in Asia Pacific. And I think it would be fair to say, Andrew, that when we first met, that you were just beginning to come out of a low point in your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And what I have seen is, and that was about 3.5 years ago, and I have absolutely seen a transformation in this man. You know, the appearance of what was always there, and the disappearance of that sadness and the confusion, and the appearance of a beautiful woman in your life. Mm-hmm. And the restoration of this incredible passion that I have seen in you, and Thank you for sharing your passion with us today and helping us, and helping me particularly, again, through hope, to actually tap into what, understand the possibility of what once looked hidden. Revealing possibilities that seemingly are impossible. And that's the theme of the conference, as you know, is alchemy. So thank you for being with us. It's been a pleasure.